Oh goodness, we got a lot to unpack. And I mean, speaking of unpacking, it's fall, technically in Florida. I don't know if you know that or not. According to what I read and according to pumpkin spice lattes, it is now fall. And so, welcome to fall. I was digging stuff out of our closet the other day. I had to go through our closet, and I was grabbing some stuff, some documents and whatever that were like buried down deep in this safe. And as I was going through it, I saw some of the things that my wife keeps around for fall that have been stored away. And there's a lot of boots. There's like a whole lot of boots that are coming your way, folks. Just look for it. You get excited about that. Apparently, she's been stockpiling in the off season to be pre-gaming for the regular season. And so she's ready with her boots. Like, she's got a lot of them. And so she had all these boots. And I remember one pair of boots she has. She has this pair of Uggs, if you remember, especially when those were like super popular, like the sweater ones. And we were living in Washington at the time. I'll never forget going to buy those because we went to a store and we walk into the store and we go in, and it was very simple. There was a salesman there, and he asked us what we were looking for. And I said, my wife really wants these like Ugg boots. I don't know what that means. That doesn't sound like a word. That sounds like an expression or a thing that I would say if I was upset, not like something I would want to buy is an Ugg. And he was like, no, we have them. We got lots of those. And he was like, they're super popular right now. So he takes us over to this wall. She tries on a couple pairs, and we buy them. We walk out. Well, a few weeks later, I worked at a fairly large church, and it was a fairly small town. And I was working at the church one day, and a guy, he sends a message. He sends me an email. Says, I'd like to come intern for you. Could I meet with you? And so a few days later, he comes into the office. We sit down. I said, tell me about yourself. He said, I go to college here in the area. I'd like to work under you, just kind of learn from you. I'd like to intern with you, if that's okay. And I was like, yeah, we're always looking for interns. That'd be great. Because, I mean, if you don't know how this works, churches love free labor. And so I was like, yeah, that'd be great. Like, that'd be fantastic. And I said, tell me about yourself. Like, I said, I'm so sorry. I don't think we've actually gotten a chance to meet. But, I apologize. Sometimes getting around the church is hard. I don't get to meet everybody as easily as I'd like. He said, no, we've met before. I said, no, we have. He's like, oh, yeah, we met. He said, you don't maybe remember me, but I helped you and your wife buy these boots. I work at a shoe store in the mall right now, and I helped you buy these boots. And I said, oh, well, you should have introduced yourself. I would have loved to have met you. He said, no, I didn't want to do that. I said, well, why not? And he said, I wanted to see how you acted. Like, I wanted to see if what I see on stage is really who you are. I wanted to see how you really act like in real life. I wanted to see if the things you think are real are real. And he was like, so I said, so how'd I do? Like, I didn't know we were secret shopping that day in reverse. I don't love it. And he was like, no, it's good. Otherwise I wouldn't be here, or whatever. Now, I think if I'm being honest with you, there's a world around us that's looking for how we act in the world. I think that's pretty common. Whether you're a Christian or not, I think people are looking for your actions. I think there's always people that are just watching you. They're looking to see if you're really a person of integrity. They're to see if you're a person that they can trust, a person that's putting good into the world. People are always watching for this stuff. They really are. And it's not just of me or not just of pastors, although I think that's part of it. I think it's not just of people who are people of faith, although I will say I think you're held to a higher and sometimes unfair standard, but a lot of times a higher standard. And I think, according to what Peter says, you should be. But I want us to look at that today, how we act in the midst of this. Now, Peter's setting up in this idea. Remember, we've kind of set up this series for a little bit. Remember, we have an author here. We have this guy, Peter, who's writing as one of Jesus' closest friends, closest disciples. And he has been with Jesus his entire life. He spent his entire adult life not just following Jesus, but then like being an apostle of Jesus. His entire adult life has really been built around this. He went from a fisherman to a fisher of men. And so he starts doing this thing for Jesus where he's now trying to put together gatherings. Jesus says, you're the rock. You're this rock. He changed his name from Simon to Peter, Petrus. And he says, you're now a rock. I'm going to build my church, my gathering on you. I'm going to put this thing around you, and it's going to be a gathering of people. That gathering is going to come together, and you're going to be the one I build this on. He sets this whole thing up with the author. Like, this is who's writing to us. But in the time that Jesus leaves and people start to follow Jesus and the rise of Christianity happens, at the same time, there's a lot of dissension that happens in the Roman community. Rome does not love this. They do not love seeing other religions start to grow. They don't really love seeing any gathering starting to grow. They don't trust gatherings. They don't trust people getting together. They don't love that there are people trying to gather. And so they really are starting to persecute at a level that we would never, ever be able to understand here in America. I just don't think, no matter what you hear on the news or what you think is happening and how bad it is as Americans, we have no understanding of how serious this is. And so as followers of Jesus, these people that are coming to know Jesus and coming to follow Jesus, they're under massive amounts of persecution, not just because Rome doesn't like it, but also because they just don't fit in the society. They just don't look like the people around them. It's something about them. The way they act is different than everybody else. One book, Larry Furtado writes, Hurtado, he's a great author on this, but if you read Destroyer of the Gods, really, really cool stuff. But he writes this, and I'll just give you a quick synopsis, but he actually writes, this is what the early followers of Jesus looked like, 5 distinct factors. He says that they don't fit in any category. First, they had ethical demands, like that they actually believed that they should live a certain way, and that ethical demand on their lives did not fit with everybody else's. There were a lot of other faiths that were, to be honest, had a lot of problems with them, or maybe had some things, again, about like the way that they perceived gods or they viewed gods that didn't have any ethical demand. It was a lot like, and I'm not trying to pick, please don't hear me wrong, I'm not trying to pick fights, but it's a lot like people I know that might say that they're like Catholic, and they would be able to live their lives, but then they would like just show up to confession, do confession, and then walk away and be like, now I just do what I want again, right? Like that's kind of the way the ethical demands of the Roman churches and the Roman gods was. But the church that was Jesus' people, they like actually believed their life should look different. That they had ethical demands on their lives. They believed in a translocal, trans-ethnic identity, meaning that it wasn't just people who were like them. It wasn't just Jews. It wasn't just new converts. It wasn't just people from one denomination or sect of the humanity. They were accepting anybody and everybody. They were accepting people that nobody else wanted. They were bringing them in droves. That's who they were looking for. And so it was trans-ethnic, but also translocal. Like it was anywhere and everywhere. They were spreading out. They were literally going to the ends of the earth. They were spreading the gospel as far as they could go. They were literally looking how they can get into the fringes and the external parts of the culture, not just into a mainstream piece. And they rejected the Roman gods. They were not part of the Roman culture. They did not see that as something they should do. They were very conservative in how they viewed only one God. There was a monotheism. This is only one God that we will follow. And they were very clear about their sexual ethic. They were not going to follow any other sexual ethic. They were very clear about how they viewed themselves. And then they actually insisted, which this is kind of crazy, on behavioral transformation. Like your life is going to change if you follow Jesus. It's not going to just be the same thing that you've always been doing. It's actually going to change. Now, in our culture, we would see this as left and right. We'd see this as like, how does this fall into our politics, basically, is what we like to look at. Like, and if I were to tell you that, the first two might actually feel a little bit more like the ethics of like how we treat the earth and how we treat one another, and really like almost like this socialistic society that they were in, where they would share everything they had, and that they were translocal and trans-ethnic, and they would welcome the foreigner. You might say that's very left-leaning, but those that are clear sexual ethic and only one God, and we're going to follow that God, you'd say it's very right-leaning, right? You'd feel like that's very, very right-leaning. And then that last one, the insisting on actual behavioral transformation, I don't think that's American at all. I think it's very un-American. Like, we don't want anybody changing our lives. Like, we do what we want. We are free in our own way that we believe, and we'll talk about that in a second, that we believe we are free people to do whatever we want whenever we want. So you don't get to change my behavior. I do what I want. That's how this is supposed to work. And I don't know if you see this or not, but they didn't fit into anything. There was a resistance to them at all times. They just didn't, their life didn't look like everybody else's. It wasn't going to be one or the other, and it wasn't going to be both and. It was something completely holistically unique in the culture they were set. So they were not going to fit into either side, but they also weren't going to be on either side. They were their completely unique thing, which brought resistance to them. And so we start seeing Christians being murdered and persecuted at really early rates, like right after Jesus. And we even see it pre-Jesus, right? You see Herod coming and trying to kill Jesus because he's the Prince of Peace, and he kills the firstborn of all these families, and all this stuff's going on. We see that happen, but it continues on with each Jesus follower. And so Peter is writing into a group of people to say, this is how you live. This is how you're supposed to do this. And you are living in a way where you are at the intersection between heaven and earth. You're in this place where you are kind of in both, a foot in both of those two camps of heaven and earth. And when you live in that way, it's going to look different than everybody around you. And here's how we do that. Now, in this piece that we're going to read, okay, in chapter 2, he starts to kind of make this transfer from who you are, which is what he started with chapter 1. Who you are, now he's going to start talking about what you do. Like, what do you do with that? And maybe you've been wondering that, like, okay, we've been talking kind of foot in both worlds. We've been talking about the author and about his audience and all these different things. But what's the agenda here? Like, what do we actually do? Well, he sets up this picture, and we're going to talk about the picture first, Then he takes the picture and he puts it into practice. He says, here's how you practice that, okay? And so today we're going to take chapter 2. We're going to kind of try to tackle as much of it as we can. I'm going to warn you, there's a lot to get through. We're going to try to go as fast as I can to kind of make sense out of this, because there's a lot going on in chapter 2. It's a beautiful, beautiful chapter. Honestly, it's my favorite chapter in this book, but also just, oh man, it is rich. And I promise you, we will not be able to plumb the depths. We will only skim the surface of how good it is. If you have a Bible, I encourage you to open to 1 Peter chapter 2. We're just going to walk right through verses 4 through 17, and we're going to kind of like try to make sense out of what he's saying here. Again, there's a picture first, and then there's a practice that comes with it. Here's what he says. So he sets up this idea. He says, as you come to him, the living stone. Now, remember, Peter is himself called the rock. Upon this rock I'll build my church. And he said his name, Peter, means rock. It is Petra, just like the 80s Christian rock band who sang "Salvation Belongs to Our God." Anybody remember that one? Oh man, that was a banger, wasn't it? Band, we missed a real opportunity today. Oh, that would have been, well, don't miss next week, okay? It's, but like he is Petra. That's his name. He is rock. But he actually doesn't use the word rock here. He doesn't say that there's a living rock. He's not trying to compare himself to Jesus here. He actually is saying there's something much greater. He used the word lithos here, which is like a stone. It is a stone. It's where we get the word like lithograph, something that you sit something on, and it's like a template for other things. It's like this idea of this stone that is coming in. It's a living stone. Notice it's not dead. It's a living stone. He says rejected by humans, which obviously he's speaking to this exile group, saying you're rejected by humans, just like he was. This is the way it's going to be for a while. Expect that. Don't think that's abnormal. That's the way it should look. Rejected by humans, but chosen by God and precious to him. This precious line is almost like I read one theologian who said it's something where it's like this community, right? This whole thing that you're getting part of, you're part of a community. But the precious part, Jesus is like saying, like, this is one thing, this is precious, this stands out to me. So it's like you and your wife may share everything. That might be normal. And you have things that you would not consider precious just to you. You probably share things with your spouse you should here. It's good. Except for like, there might be like a toothbrush where you're like, hey, no. Like, no, we got lines here, okay? Like, that's disgusting, like, I will kiss you, but I will not accept your plaque. I don't take that with me, so like, there's like a line here. It's precious to you. It's still mine. It's still my thing. I love in The Shack. Anybody, if you've ever read The Shack, which I don't agree with all of the book, The Shack, but if you remember that book by Paul Young, I remember I had time with him one time. He and I were at a thing together. I had time to talk to him, and I remember we were just chatting, and I was doing worship, and he was speaking, and I asked him about some of the parts of The Shack. I just read the book because I was going to be there with him. I was like, tell me about that. And I said, I love this line that you use over and over again. He said, it's this line that is especially fond. He uses this line throughout The Shack, if you remember this. It says, every time Jesus talks to anybody, he says, I'm especially fond of you. To every single person, I'm especially fond of you. I said, I love that line. He's like, yeah, it took me a while to figure out what it would be. But how does God feel especially fond of like every single one of us? Like, how does he feel like that's the way he sees us, as well as how does he see Jesus? He sees us as like especially fond of us. And he says, just as that, we are precious to him, and Jesus is precious to him, and you also, not just Jesus, all of us are like this. You also, like living stones, you're all living stones, and you're being built into. And what are you being built into? Now, this is like where the anticipation comes in. He's setting something up. You're being built into something. Now, building something creates anticipation. It feels like we're heading towards something when he writes this. It feels like he's like setting something up. If you ever see this, like when there's a sign that says like coming soon, everybody wants to know what that building's going to be, right? And then you look it up on Trinity Chat and you find out it's just another car wash. But you're like, could have been something great. Could have been. We had a shot to get a Four Rivers up here. Right? Anybody, Four Rivers people, the barbecue place down in Tampa? We're in a petition to get them up here. We're working on it. Billy and I have our plans. Did you ever go there, by the way, on the sign, like right at the front, on the like read their story. They have their story written out, and the first line is whatever the guy's name is, like John's barbecue ministry began. And I'm like, yeah, that's why it's so good, because it's a barbecue ministry. He sees how important this is. This isn't just food. This is spiritual that he's doing this. Anyways, so we're working on that. Like, you think it's going to be something awesome. You're not sure. This is something awesome. What he sets up is he actually says, you are being built into a spiritual house. The other words would be, in the same context, is a spiritual temple. You're being built into a temple or a spiritual house. That's what you're creating. You're actually housing the Spirit of God. That's what you're going to do collectively as a group together. A holy priesthood, offering spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. Like, that's what's going to happen here. You're going to be able to accept these sacrifices. You're going to be the place of worship. You are where the Spirit of God is going to dwell. That's what you're going to be. Now, Rodney Stark, who writes the Triumph of Christianity, which is just a great, again, it's very dry, but it's really interesting history. He says this about the temples. He talks about how these spiritual houses were built. He says, in most societies, pagan temples, which would become Christian temples, were served by an exclusive priesthood, either based on hereditary religious caste or recruited from the elite. They served a clientele rather than a membership. So it wasn't like you were part of it collectively forever. It was kind of a coming and going, but there was this part of like a priesthood. There were people in it that would be part of that. It said clients came to the temple from various festivals from time to time in pursuit of spiritual and material benefits. But most often the temple served as eating clubs. They would literally come in. From time to time, someone would donate an animal to be sacrificed at the altar, and the donor and the donor's friends would have a feast on the meat. Temple employees were skilled chefs. Like, they actually had these very skilled chefs there. For many of those involved in the temples, these banquets were the sum of their participation. That's all it was. So people would come into these temples, and they would actually be part of this, and they would bring in their sacrifices. This was a normal thing, and they had a priesthood who was part of these. But this one's different than that. He's setting up something very different than that. He's not just saying this is like just a place to come hang out. When Peter's talking about this, it's not just, I think some of us, that's what we think the temple is today, for being honest. I think some of us still see the temple as that, where it's just a nice little supper club. We come to church because it's a nice little social club. We come to churches because it might help our career. We might work with the right people. We might say the right things to the right people. It might just make us feel better about ourselves. We come to church because it's like a cool thing to do, or it's just the right thing to do, or it's been ingrained in us for so long. And that's why we come. We forget what the real meaning of coming to church or being a part of what this temple is, why it really matters. Being a part of this community is much bigger. Not just this community, but the church community. The believers in Christ is so much bigger than what it is just to show up once a week and have a meal together or hang out together or just see the right people together. So much more than that. In the Old Testament, we see that the temple becomes a literal place where heaven meets earth. Heaven and earth meet in the temple. That's where they show up. At the beginning of time, like Genesis 1, what we see is that if you were to take, we forget that like heaven is not a physical place that is just like somewhere else. Like, heaven is not like the next room over. It's not like I'm here and heaven is over there. They are like two dimensions that kind of work and sometimes seem to overlap. But they are not just two places right next to each other. It's not like I'm standing in heaven, somebody else is standing in earth, whatever. They are not like that. They're two dimensions that kind of overlap at times. At the beginning of time, they were completely overlapped. It was like two circles on the Venn diagram that made one perfect circle. That's what we see. When God is walking through the garden in the cool of the day with Adam and Eve, he is fully present. Heaven is not somewhere else. Heaven is right there on the earth with humans. We were all part of just one collective heaven and earth. It was all one place. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. There was nothing separating those two things. And then God gives a mandate, which is very interesting if you think about this. Because then God gives a mandate in Genesis 1, verse 28, where he says to them, he says, God blessed them, Adam and Eve, and he says, be fruitful and increase in number. Fill the earth and subdue it. Rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky and over every creature that moves along the ground. This is called the Genesis mandate. Now, he actually tells them, you're going to rule over all this and you're going to move it. Like he actually says a few times, you're going to keep moving this. You're going to expand it. You're going to grow it. Now, that's interesting if you think about it, because wouldn't you think that God should say, what you're going to do is you're just going to stay inside this garden. Like, don't leave. Don't go through the exit gate unless you get your hand stamped because you're not getting back in. Like, isn't that what he should be saying to people? Like, we're confined in this place. This is where goodness is. Everything outside of here is bad things. So stay here. That's not what he says. He actually wants them to increase it, to take this thing, this heaven and earth, and to expand heaven and earth, like to actually like take it and rule it and subdue it, to grow it, to multiply it, which is very interesting. And so he kind of sets up this idea. Now we see in Genesis 11 that it all kind of falls apart, right? Genesis 11, you show up and they're supposed to build this temple, this heaven and earth, but instead they build a tower of Babel to themselves. They even say, so we can make a name for ourselves. So if it really backfires, they say we're building a tower to make a name for ourselves. And so it starts to fall apart, right? We don't want the heaven that God's offered us. We want the earth that we can rule. We want that one instead. And so the two start to separate. This heaven and earth, the two circles in the Venn diagram kind of separate a little bit. But there's still times where they come back together. In Exodus, we see when God's Spirit shows up at the foot of Mount Sinai. And he shows up there at the foot of Mount Sinai and says, make a tabernacle for me, and I will put my presence into that tabernacle. And literally the Spirit of God, this heaven and earth start to meet inside of this tabernacle. And it was believed when you went to that tabernacle, it wasn't just that you were going there and that's just where the Spirit of God was. It was where heaven and earth were meeting. You were seeing God show up in that place. And so we see that in Exodus, and then in Chronicles, you see that Solomon then builds like a full temple, not just a tabernacle, but a building that would be structurally sound and stay put forever. That place would be built, and it brings the Spirit of God. It says that the Holy Spirit came and rested inside of that temple. That temple was where heaven and earth met. That's what it was believed to be. It was more than just a building, more than just a place you went to. It was where heaven and earth met inside of that. Now, when they built that temple, and if you read the Old Testament, you'll find this is kind of interesting, is that when they built that temple, when they built all the pieces around those temples, they built them with a certain kind of imagery on it where you would see lots of trees, lots of fruit, lots of leaves, lots of creatures. And why they did that was because that temple was supposed to look a lot like the garden. They wanted it to look like the garden. It was imagery of the garden because that's where heaven and earth were meeting. Then that temple's torn down. Herod rebuilds it before Jesus shows up. The temple that we would see Jesus going to was actually called Herod's temple, but he rebuilt Solomon's temple. But they didn't need the temple anymore because in John chapter 1, verse 14, we see that Jesus arrives, remember? And all of a sudden John says, the Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. What's the word dwelling there? The word dwelling there in Greek is the word tabernacle. He tabernacled among us. He is where the Spirit of God is. He is where heaven and earth are meeting. And guess what? He doesn't just stay in one place. He goes out. He expands the kingdom to people that you wouldn't expect. He goes to Samaritans. He goes to people we would call sinners. He goes to people we would call prostitutes. He goes to even people we would call tax collectors. And he expands the kingdom as he does this. See, this heaven and earth are meeting again inside of him. Now, he is where the two come together, and he expands that kingdom. And he then tells his disciples, you're going to go expand the kingdom the same way. You're going to be where heaven and earth continue to meet. And it's not going to meet through me, but it's going to meet through you gathering together in my name. That is what this temple looks like. That's what it's going to be. He says that's how this is going to work. And then from there, we get all the way to Revelation, where at the end of time, we get this beautiful picture in Revelation, where at the end of Revelation, John says, then I saw a new heaven and a new earth. And they've now reconnected again. For the first heaven and earth had passed away, and there was no longer any sea. And I saw the holy city, a new Jerusalem, that was coming down out of heaven. Notice this, it did not take us up out of earth to heaven. Heaven came down to earth. And it was prepared as a bride beautifully dressed for her husband. I heard a loud voice saying, look, God's dwelling place is now among the people. And he will dwell with them. They will be his people. And God himself will be their God. There was no separation of heaven and earth anymore. There's kingdom is here. And sometimes there's these thin spaces. There's these little things where the two still come together. Where the two places still show up. Where these two things still come together and mean something. This is why this matters. This is why coming to be a part of a gathering like this is more than just a place to show up on a Sunday morning. It's more than just a routine we're supposed to be in. It's more than just people we're supposed to network with or people we're supposed to be nice to. It's so much more than that. This is supposed to be where the place like where actually heaven and earth are supposed to collide and start to meet up in this place. This is why when you go to Bible studies or gatherings like that, this is why this matters. This is why you're home, if I'm being honest. This is why your home should not just be a castle to an empire of earth, but it should be a kingdom outpost for people who need to see the kingdom of heaven in your neighborhood. Like, we have to live that way in everyday scenarios. You are a living stone. You are out there. When you go to work, you are a part of this heaven and earth colliding that's in your workplace. You are a part of heaven and earth colliding that is in your neighborhood, in your book club, in your Starbucks. You are a part of heaven and earth colliding. That's what this is calling us to. Every single day, every place we go, we are living stones. We are part of this. We're part of building this temple. And this is, the goal is that we get to what Psalm 72 says, where Psalm 72 says that the whole earth, this is what the goal is, that the whole earth will be filled with his glory. See this language over and over again. Why is that? Because the goal was that heaven and earth would collide and the two circles would overlap and that everything would be filled with his glory. Every single inch of this place, every exile, every foreigner, every person that we don't agree with or always love, that person would also feel that they are part of being part of his glory. They're invited into this kingdom of heaven. That's our role on this earth. Dallas Willard writes about this and Willard's just great on all this, like, very practical stuff. But when he writes about this, he talks about how this is the most important thing that Christians need to do. Like, the most important thing. So there's a lot of important things happening in our world right now. There's a lot of things that we should be doing or dealing with in our lives. But he says that the most important thing that Christians need to do is actually get out there and do this. Like, actually to show up to these things and be people who are supposed to be people who are in our communities and expanding the kingdom of heaven all throughout earth. That's what our goal is. That's what our job is. It's the most important thing we can do. But come back with me just for a second here, because this whole foundation of this temple is not on us. It's not me and you. The foundation of this temple is Jesus himself. He says, for Scripture, verse 6, chapter 2, verse 6, for in Scripture it says, see, I lay a stone in Zion, a chosen and precious cornerstone, and the one who trusts in him will never be put to shame. Now, you who believe this stone is precious, but to those who don't believe, the stone the builders rejected has become that cornerstone, the one upon which all of this is built. And a stone that causes people to stumble, and a rock that makes them fall. They stumble because they disobey the message, which is also what they were destined for. Now, these stones do matter. They are important. And what he's saying is Jesus is the cornerstone upon which this entire thing is built. A few months ago, I was over in Greece, and I was at the Acropolis, and watching how the Acropolis was built, and looking at different things. These are some vacation photos. I know you came here to see my slides on my vacation, and it's pretty cool. You're captive, and so I'm going to do this. But I'm seeing, this is at the Acropolis in Greece, and this is a temple that was built. This is an actual temple built to the goddess Athena, right? That's why it's Athens, Greece. And it was built to Athena. The whole thing revolves around her. But here's what's interesting is they knew, the Greeks were very smart in how they were building temples. And it's a little bit of stuff that we use today. But as you stood back from it, so this, for instance, you can see cranes and all kinds of stuff in the background. I have no idea how they could put this thing together, because they were using cranes and rebuilding the Acropolis while we were there. And they said it was going to take about a decade to rebuild it. And we have machines, we have cranes that lift rocks and move things around. I mean, when you think about how humans did this with no machinery, it is unbelievable that this thing is 2,000 years old. It's incredible to see how much of it's still standing, how much of it was made this way. But what they did was they would have rocks like this, these are capstones on the top, and they would already decorate them. So they would have them etched so that they would have a pattern or words on them, and then they would put them up later, knowing that they need to line up with the rocks that were going to go next to them. But they couldn't get to that top part until they started with the bottom, with the cornerstone. And it was interesting because what they used on the columns, as the columns go up, they actually get thinner. And it was to divert your eye, to make your eye think that the building was taller than it was. So as you look up, it looks smaller and smaller. And that's an optical illusion to make you think the building is even taller than it was. Now, here's why that matters is think about how much pre-planning had to go into this. You got one shot at this. This wasn't something where you could put it up and then be well, let's re-chisel it now. It was there. And so they had to think about this, like, how big are we starting? What are we starting with so that we can create this optical illusion where these go higher and higher and thinner and thinner? They're building this so that you could see this. It's why we use skyscrapers kind of the way we do today, to be honest, is they have that, they get thinner and thinner as they go. Part of that is structural, and part of that is because it starts to feel as though they disappear into the heavens because they get smaller and smaller. They look further and further away. And what they were trying to do in these temples is they were trying to show that they were actually going closer and closer to heaven, that you would actually see it start to disappear into the heavens. Like it was starting to actually, like you would lose it into the heavens because it was so tall and so grandiose that it was like losing it into the heavens. You couldn't always tell where heaven and earth were separated. In fact, they seemed to be like closer than ever. They seemed to be like on top of each other, like one cohesive thing of heaven and earth. That was the goal of the temples. And it was the goal of the temple that Jesus was building, but he wasn't building it to go up. He wasn't building it to be a Tower of Babel. He was building it to be through people who would spread it out. He wasn't building a monument to himself. He was building a movement that would be his, that would go out into the world and spread what that looked like to be the kingdom of heaven here on earth. And so they were building this up. They were building this up into the heavens, and that's what he's trying to say. Now here's this is where he kind of changes gears for us, because the picture starts to look a little bit more like practice here, because he's going to give us not just an identity of who we are, but he's going to give us responsibility. And here's the responsibility that comes with being part of this temple. He says, verse 9, "But you're a chosen people, you're a royal priesthood, a holy nation, you're God's special possession, that you may declare the praises of him who called you out of darkness and into his wonderful light. Once you were not a people, like you weren't even a collective thing, but now you are people of God. Once you had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy." Like you weren't part of any kingdom. You were part of the empires of this world, but guess what? Now you're part of this kingdom. And you have responsibility within this kingdom. And so when we think about being part of this kingdom, citizens of this kingdom, what does that mean? We have to pray. Literally what Jesus says is that your kingdom come and your will be done. Your kingdom come, your will be done. What that tells us is there's two different wills. There's a will of the kingdom of heaven and there's a will of the empire of earth. They're not the same. And we have to pray that his will be done. And here's one of the things I've found is that I have to pray not just that his kingdom would come, but I have to pray that my kingdom would go. Like I have to let go of some things. His kingdom can't just show up and like add on to what I'm already doing. It doesn't just show up and it like just kind of like is I've already put down my cornerstone and now you build on it. No. I have to clear the entire path. I have to clear the entire place so that the foundation is his and that he sets up his cornerstone and everything is built on that. He's not building on what I've already set up. I'm building on what he set up. I'm doing what he's already set up for me. And sometimes I have to pray that my kingdom would get out of the way. My kingdom would not be part of that. Dallas Willard talks about this too when he talks about how we need to pray. He says, when Jesus directs us to pray, thy kingdom come, he does not mean we should pray for it to come into existence. Like it's already existing. He's saying rather we pray for it to take over at all points. In the personal, in the social, and political order where it's now excluded. On earth as it is in heaven. With this prayer, we are invoking it. Like it's already existing. You're just bringing it in. As in faith, we are acting it into the real world of our daily, like everyday existence. Not just a one-time thing, not just a one-off, but every single day into our existence. So here he moves and he says, now Peter's going to set us up. He says, now it's not just the picture. That's the picture I want to give you. But let me talk about the practice of it. Here's how the rubber meets the road. And he sets up this, these next two verses. We could spend, I don't know, the rest of our lives figuring out how to live them out. But here's what he says. Verse 11. He says, dear friends, I urge you, as foreigners and exiles. You don't belong here. This isn't your home. This isn't your kingdom. This isn't your empire. You are now citizens of a different place. As foreigners and exiles, to abstain from sinful desires. They're going to wage war on your soul. I don't think I have to explain that to you, how sinful desires just wage war on our soul. Like how they will hurt us and they will make us less than human. They will make us people who do not love fully because our sinful desires will not get out of the way. It's really hard to love other people when you're struggling with a lot of pride. It's really hard to love other people when you're struggling with a lot of greed. It's really hard to actually truly love anybody when you're struggling with a lot of lust. Lust is the exact opposite of love. Love is putting somebody else in first. Lust is putting yourself first. Right? Pride is very hard to do that same thing with. Like, this is very hard for us to do this properly if we're struggling with these sinful desires that are waging war on our soul. And then here's how he flips it. He says, but here's what you do. Live such good lives among the pagans that though they accuse you of doing wrong, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day he visits us. Now he goes further. We'll come back to these in just a second. He goes further and he says this, submit yourselves for the Lord's sake to every human authority, which, oh boy, you don't hear that taught, do you? I don't know if you've been around the church in the last, I don't know, especially like the last 4 years of our country. I haven't heard this one a whole lot. Man, I feel like it's been a while since that one's been taught. To submit ourselves to human authorities, that it's for the sake, that for the Lord's sake we're doing that? Oh, it's wild. I'm not going to tell you how to live that out. I'm just saying, I haven't heard anybody talk about that one. Whether to the emperor as the supreme authority or to the governors who are sent by him to punish you, just so you know, the people who are there to punish you, you're supposed to submit yourself to them as well? That's not the American way. I'll tell you that right now. Submit yourself to the people who are there to punish you, and for those who do wrong, and commend those who do right. For it is God's will that by doing good, not by fighting them, not by getting into the weeds with them, not by becoming aggressive with them. No, not by doing that, but by just doing good. You should silence the ignorant talk of foolish people. Live as free people. Now he's saying live as free people to people who are not free at the moment. Like they're not free. So he's saying live as free people, even though you're not under what we would consider freedom. This is, again, one of the problems I think we have. We don't have time to get into this today. But again, one of the issues we have is that we misconstrue the word freedom all the time. We think that freedom is something that we have as Americans, and it means we get to do whatever we want. That is not the biblical definition of freedom. In fact, the biblical definition of freedom, when Paul talks about freedom, he's talking about this war between flesh and freedom, flesh and the spirit. And when he talks about that, he's not talking about doing less than. We think freedom means I get to do what I want when I want. He's actually saying, no. God has given you freedom that you can choose better than that. Like you're a human. You can choose better than just the base nature that you have. You don't have to live in lust and pride and greed. You don't have to live in the carnal state that your animal instincts tell you. You have freedom from those things. You have freedom from the flesh. Live better than, not down to the level of, but higher levels that Jesus has called you into of freedom. You are free. It doesn't matter what your government says. It doesn't matter what other people say to you. It does not matter what the world you're living in. You are free because you've been able to be freed up from the flesh. Not from oppression, not from suffering. You'll never, in this book, Peter talks about suffering in almost every single chapter. He talks about suffering. Suffering is part of what he talks to us about. You would think that we would be free when we're free from suffering. That's not the case. You will still suffer, but you can still be free. You can still have oppression and still be free. Because Jesus has freed you up for more than that. As a spiritual battle, he has freed you up. And it's more important. So do not, he says, do not use it as a cover-up for evil. Like, don't think that just because you're free, you can do whatever you want. Live as God's slaves. Show proper respect to everyone. Love the family of believers. Fear God. And even honor the emperor. Now, for us, I think there's a couple things, because once we live in this, what we start to find is it's hard, because we live in a world where religion or our view of religion, our following of Jesus, there's a lot of resistance. So he says all this and it sounds good, but it's like, but how do I do that? Because when I live in this culture, there's a lot of resistance to me living in a different way than the people around me. People are going to give me a hard time about that. People aren't going to understand it. It's going to look different. It's going to be harder to be a part of that. I'm going to have to choose things nobody else has to choose. We have to decide against things or for things that nobody else, it's not going to be a popular stance. How do I do it? How do I actually do that? I mean, one of the biggest articles that was written in the last 20 years was an article by Christopher Hitchens who literally said that religion poisons everything. This is the world we live in. You guys know this stuff, Richard Dawkins, people like that saying that God is dead and there is no God, or people who believe in atheism or agnosticism who are saying this is the worst the world is going to be. And religion's making it worse. What you're choosing is making it worse. We're taught that in our culture. How do we actually live like that? What do we do when people come at us this way? And here's what I see. In the Christian culture, there's a few different things that we do. And I just want to give you a couple things and try to find a better way about this. First is we sometimes become very aggressive. We become aggressive towards those who are different than us, who think different than us or whatever. Notice what Peter says in this. He does not say, I urge you to fight those people. I urge you to punch them in the mouth. I urge you to take shots at them. I urge you to be mean to them. I urge you to bully them. I urge you to be more intellectual than them. I urge you to whatever. He doesn't say any of these things. He says, I urge you to live such good lives. But we sometimes become very aggressive in this. We literally want to fight back with people. We see it all the time. And what we do is we join sometimes it's a political thing. We'll join a political piece of this and think that's going to fix it. So we become politically active or whatever, or become activists in the culture to be the whole culture should look like Christians. So every law that's passed, everything that happens in this culture, you should have a Christian ethic to that. I'm not saying that's bad. I do believe there's some good things about that. But at the same time, we get so hung up on that our activism actually takes away from what we're supposed to do. If you've ever read the Screw Tape Letters by C.S. Lewis, in the Screw Tape Letters, C.S. Lewis writes about how the enemy is trying to distract. I love this, by the way. In Screw Tape Letters, it's never how to destroy somebody, it's how to distract them. Because I think a lot of times Satan is not worried about destroying us, he's worried about distracting us. Because it's way easier. And then we just fall off the radar. And the enemy in this, if you remember, he calls hell the kingdom of noise. Just constant noise coming at you. And he says this, he talks about, this is Satan basically talking about how he would distract a follower of Jesus in this. And he says, as long as activism matters more to him than genuine religious practices, he's in our grip. And the more he prioritizes those worldly causes under the guise of being religious, the better. We think that's going to fix it all. But Peter doesn't say that. He doesn't say, you know what you need to do is get politically active. You need to run for Senate or something, and then you'll fix it all. No, he says, live such good lives. That's where it starts. Live such good lives. Some of us, we have a really hard time with this because what happens is if we start to go down this path and we start to go towards fighting every single battle, what happens is we forget to talk about what we're for and we only become people who talk about what we're against. We only talk about the things we don't like or the things we hate instead of talking about the one who we love. And our mission and our message gets lost in all of that. We lose our voice because we're screaming for the less important things. And Jesus is saying, don't waste your voice on that. Like Peter's telling us, don't get too hung up on that stuff. Because what will happen is you'll become part of a tribe, not part of a community. He's calling us into being a community, a part of a temple, where we see the Spirit of God at work, and we see the intermixing of heaven and earth in one place. And instead, he's saying what you're going to do is you're going to become part of not a community, but a tribe. And a tribe is not a group of people who talk about what they're for. It's a group that talks about what they're against. It's not a group that gathers together because of what they love. It's a group that gathers together because of what they hate. You can find just as many Facebook groups that are about what you hate as much about what you love. I mean, we can find just as many that are like, Chevys suck and Ford's the best, whatever it is. You can find just as many that are like, this is the worst thing and this is the best thing. And there's a reason for that, because some of us, we get stuck into tribalism and we start falling into what we hate instead of talking about what we love. He's telling us in this passage, no, you're here because of what you love, because you've been called into a community to show what heaven and earth look like when they are in the same place at the same time. Some of us, we become this and we miss out on what we're for, and we become what we're against. But some of us, then we go the other route and we're very passive in how we handle things. So we're kind of passive in how we do this. Instead of being people who are assertive to this, we become really passive when we feel like there's resistance against us. So we actually start to kind of clam up a little bit. We get a little bit quieter about it. We start to kind of play into those things. I know for me, if I'm being honest with you, there are times where being a Christian in this culture, it is hard to say you are. It is. It's not that easy to always say it. Or to be like, this is how I live my life. I choose things differently than you do. I don't spend my money the way you spend your money because I follow Jesus. I don't have the same sexual ethic as you because I follow Jesus. I actually value the marriage that I'm in or the relationship I'm in because I follow Jesus. I'm not going to go outside of that. I raise my kids a certain way because I follow Jesus. It's hard to have that conversation sometimes. I mean, admitting that you're a Christian is sometimes feels like you're admitting you're a Michael Bublé fan or something weird, where you're like who listens to that guy? And you're like, me? Oof, I remember a few years ago, I've shared it before, but I remember a few years ago I was watching Regis. It was Kelly and Michael. Kelly and Michael. It's not Regis and any of those people anymore. Kelly and Michael were on at the time, and they were doing their show. And I remember seeing Lenny Kravitz came on the show. The guy, American Woman, He Wants to Fly Away, that guy. And Lenny Kravitz is on. And of course he's wearing really nice, really tight leather pants. And he had, his nose ring and his glasses and whatever. Mainly I enjoy him from the Hunger Games. Really important role he played in the Hunger Games, probably his best work. And he was on the show though, and he was talking about his new album. And I remember they pulled up the album and they showed this little album. And I said, hey, what does this mean? And it was a picture of him on the front of the album. And it was a picture of him, and he was naked. And then he was walking up out of a pool of blood. It was a red pool, and it was looked like blood. And he had a guitar that was kind of strategically placed, in a certain area. And they said, what does this mean? What's this? And I remember the way he said it, it blew my mind, because I didn't know you could just do this. And he goes, oh, well, it's pretty simple. He said, I'm naked because I'm being reborn. And that blood is the blood of Jesus, and I'm coming up out of the blood of Jesus, and I have a guitar on because I'm going to sing songs about the new person I am in Jesus. Yeah, he just said it. Just said it like a human out loud. And I was like, you can't do that. You can't just talk like that about Jesus and about your life and things. You got to hide it. You got to code it. You got to mask it a little bit. And he said it so, matter of fact, and Regis and Michael and Kelly were like, yeah, okay. I mean, they were fine with it. It wasn't a big deal. It was he just said it so matter of fact. I didn't know you could do that. I thought when I saw the album that he had learned about a new narcotic and it just he took a picture while on peyote or something. I was like, well, he's living his life. I don't know. It was a whole thing on Jesus. It was amazing. And I was like, that's so incredible that he just says it. It was so assertive. It was just so out there. And again, for some of us, I think we're so concerned about this. But I've also been in places, I don't know about you, I've lived in places that are very liberal and I've lived in very conservative places too. Very liberal places too, where people don't talk about Jesus and it's a bad word or whatever. When I lived out in the Pacific Northwest, that was kind of the way it worked. It felt that way a lot, where religion was really hard to talk about, anything about faith. But I would also have people come into my house all the time, and they were had just become vegans, because that was the thing to do at the time. And so they'd all become vegans. They were all coming to my house, and they're all telling me how much better their bowel movements are now that they're vegans. And I'm if you can talk about that, I can talk about Jesus. I don't need to hear about that's gross. Let me tell you about Jesus. If we're going to have this exchange of ideas back and forth, I think I'm allowed to put this into the conversation. But it's weird how we've, I think, become that way. We're so fearful of this. Peter's saying, if you live such good lives, it's not going to matter. Because people are actually going to wonder, how do you do this? If you're parenting that way, if you have a relationship that way, if you have a marriage that works that way, if you're great at your job that way, there's people that are going to wonder about it because you're living such good lives in front of them. There's a reason they're going to wonder about it. They should. And that you have that wiggle room to say, this is why I do this, is how I live the way I do. And so some of us do those things. We become maybe too passive. We become a little bit afraid of these things, right? And then some of us become passive aggressive. Put the two together. And that's where we start cutting people out of our lives that we don't agree with. You know what I'm talking about? Anybody? Where it's like they don't think like I do. They don't believe in Jesus the way I do. And therefore, I need to just end this, like get them out of my life altogether. Now, I'm not saying that all the time that is not like whatever. Maybe necessary, maybe not. But I also know a lot of people, I know more than one, who, that person who is an atheist, that person who's agnostic, that person who is gay, that they're cut out. That person who, even at this point, that is trans, they're just cut out of my entire life. I know many people who have had this conversation with me who have said, like, well, they decided this, and therefore I'm not supporting them anymore. I'm not going to be part of their life anymore. How do you think they're going to find out about Jesus? What do you think their plan B is? Like, if you intentionally remove yourself out of that, you just took the intersection of the kingdom of heaven and earth, and you just removed it from their life? Is that going to help? Is that going to make it better? But we oh man, I remember years ago, I remember reading a study. This is when I was in college. It really bothered me. But I remember there was a study at the time where the AIDS epidemic was just at its height in Africa. People dying left and right from AIDS. A very curable disease at the time, actually. But one of the research studies that I read said that 90% of Christians felt the AIDS epidemic was not their problem to worry about. It was not their problem to worry about it. Because, well, they're sexually doing things that we don't approve of. Therefore, we don't have to worry about that. That's not our issue. 90%. Because we just didn't agree with their ethics on these things. Maybe we just need to live such good lives and let the rest take care of itself. Is that living such a good life? Is that what that means? How do we put the kingdom of heaven in front of people if that's how we're going to live? And we do this passive-aggressive thing all the time where it's like, well, that's how I'll handle it. It's not better. Instead, there's an assertiveness to just how we handle these things. There's an assertiveness to how we're supposed to be part of these things. There's like a way that it's not about being part of a political movement or changing things or upending things. It's about like how we actually just engage with people. Like we're actually supposed to do that. There's a great author who writes about this. Miroslav Volf is his name, and he's a Yale scholar, and he writes about this quite a bit. But he actually says that this is how Peter's followers would have seen this. And when he writes about it, he talks about this. He writes a whole thing on just 1 Peter itself. But when he writes, he's saying that their whole goal was not to make a political movement. It was not to have a fight of a political form. It was actually that here he says, here we go. We get no sense from 1 Peter that the church should strive to regulate all domains of social life. That's not what we're here to do. And reshape society into the image of a heavenly Jerusalem. We're not here to do that for everybody. But it says Peter's community did not wish to impose itself or the kingdom of God on the world, but to live in faithfulness to God and to the values of God's kingdom and invite others to do the same. It had no desire to do for others what they did not want done to them, for they had no covert totalitarian agenda. Rather, the community was to live in an alternate way of life and present present social settings, transforming it as they could from within, not from outside, but from within. In any case, the community did not seek to exert social or political pressure, but to give public witness to a new way of life, giving public witness. Not just hiding it, but still being public about it. For some of us, I think that's like really terrifying. We don't like that idea a whole lot. But when we live that way, it really matters. I was reading this beautiful article that came out not long ago. And it was about a guy, if you're not familiar with this whole backstory, I don't need to get into it, but there was a man, his name's Christopher Hitchens, who we read just a second ago, who said that religion poisons everything. Christopher Hitchens is a writer. He was very well known for his views on God. He wrote many books as an atheist about how God, he had a book, his most famous book was called God is Not Great. He was known to be a very secular humanist and not an atheist, did not have any belief in God. And there was a man on the other side of that whose name was Francis Collins. And Francis Collins was a scientist who heads up the Human Genome Project. If you're not familiar with that, kind of how we do genome studies of diseases and how we can maybe alter genomes to create or lack of cancer or lack of different like massive amounts of disease in our culture. And so Francis Collins was promoted in 2009 under the Obama administration to become the head of the NIH. Now, Francis Collins was also a very strong Christian man who believed strongly in the principles of Jesus and was very clear about that. And so many scholars came out speaking against Francis Collins, saying he should not be in charge of science because he's a Christian. He can't do both. That's impossible. And so many people spoke out. Steven Pinker spoke out. If you're not familiar with him, I mean, he's written 1 million books on this kind of stuff. Steven Pinker, he's a Harvard guy. He wrote about how this man should not be in charge. Francis Collins should not be in charge. They said he can't do this because he's part of the NIH and because he's a Christian. He can't be both at the same time. Well, then even this man, who I just mentioned, Christopher Hitchens, wrote a whole article saying Francis Collins is unfit with his faith and his beliefs to be a person who can navigate this. He said he's unfit. He should not be in charge of this. But what's interesting is in 2010, Christopher Hitchens, this atheist, found out he had cancer and that it was probably fatal. And of all people who reached out to him was the guy he had written everything against, a guy who was a Christian, a guy who was the head of the National Institute of Health, and wrote him and said, hey, I'm working on this in my genome projects. I would love to help you if I can. Can I help you try to cure this cancer with what resources I do have at my disposal? He said, let me just try. And he reached out to a guy who had hated him for his religious beliefs and said, let me try to help you. Even though I'm a Christian, even though we don't agree on science, we're not going to agree on everything, let me try to help you. And when he made that offer, Christopher Hitchens took him up on it and took up a Christian's offer to help him as an atheist. And they worked together on this. Unfortunately, Christopher Hitchens passed away in 2010. They could not figure out the cure. But before he passed away, Christopher Hitchens did write things about him again. And he totally changed his tune. He changed his tune on Francis Collins as a Christian. And he said he is one of the best Americans alive. He's one of the greatest Americans. And he said he is the best of the faithful. Meaning of all religious people, he's the best of the faithful. Suddenly they'd had this relationship because he had done good work for him. He was doing good work in the culture he was in. There are some reports, and I don't know all of them, but there are some reports that Christopher Hitchens actually had a faith conversion at the end of his life after spending his entire life writing as an atheist because somebody reached out to him and somebody was doing good work in front of him. Somebody was willing to live such a good life and put themselves on the line for somebody that didn't believe anything like them. The question is, are we going to be those people? Are we going to be people in our society who are aggressive or are passive or passive-aggressive? Or are we going to be like this intersection of heaven and earth, this temple that Jesus is working through, these living stones where heaven and earth collide in our lives, and we get to bring that and send that out into the world that needs it so bad, out to the fringes, not just staying in one place, but to the people around us who need it so desperately? Are we going to go to those people who nobody else goes to? Are we going to be part of their lives and show up in places that nobody would expect because we are part of this temple? We're living stones that are taking this temple message out into the world that needs it so much. As you think about your spaces you're in your week and in your life, I would encourage you to think about this and who are those people that maybe you've alienated or you've pushed to the side, the people maybe you have a broken relationship with right now that you may need to repair or restore because you need to be back in their lives and live such good lives. Live such good lives in front of them. Now, we're not going to live good lives on our own. We need the cornerstone to do that. We need to be built upon that foundation. And so would we be able to be people who live in that and are built up by that cornerstone, living stones in this world, to be able to go out and live such good lives, bringing the intersection of heaven and earth to the world that needs it so much? If you would, let's stand together as we close. And I just want to pray over you as we go into a week where I'm sure you're going to have a lot of moments like this that you're going to come against. And I promise you, there's no time like this where like after a message like this that it's not going to actually show up in your life. So I just want to warn you, something's probably going to happen this week. There's probably going to be something where there's some friction, some resistance. I'm just going to warn you about that. And so I want to pray over you as you go into your week and into the place you're going to be in. Jesus, I thank you for your example. I thank you that you are this intersection of heaven and earth that came here to be the sacrifice for us. That came here to show us what it looks like to live in this tabernacle way. And I pray that we would be people who are living stones of this temple that you're building. That first of all, we would build ourselves on the foundation that you've laid. But as we reach up to the heavens, as we reach into these two convergent spaces, that we would find ourselves in these two different dimensions at the same time. We'd be living in the way of heaven, even here in the empires of earth. That we would be living in the way of heaven, even when it's hard and there's resistance. There's people that don't agree with us, where there's difficult conversations, people that may not feel the same way we do, or think the same way we do, or believe the same things we do. But when we meet them, would we meet them with love and with grace, and we meet them with such good lives that there is no choice but to see the work that you've done in our lives, and to see the work you're doing through our lives, and to want to join that kingdom of heaven as well. We thank you for this incredible responsibility that you've put on our shoulders to do this. Not just an identity, but a responsibility to go out into the world and do this. That you've laid this in place for literally since the beginning of time, and now we get to be your messengers and your people who go and live this way. May we be a royal priesthood. May we be a holy people, set apart for you and for your good works. May that be true of us, not just in this building, but as we leave this place. Jesus, we pray over our homes right now. We pray over our workplaces right now. We pray over the coffee shops we go into. We pray over the spaces that we're going to inhabit this week. And I pray for each person that we're going to come in contact with. May we live the lives that you've called us to, and be the people that you've made us to be, that you've empowered us to be. We love you. We thank you for your love for us. I pray we would show your love to people in every arena, through our hearts, through our minds, through our souls, and through our strength, that we would love our neighbors as ourselves. I pray these things in your name. Amen.